So what you've been seeing here at Yellow Ferry and at Issaquah Dock are state-of-the-art houseboat communities. They're all wired up with sewage and electrical and DSL and phone lines and everything else, okay? The scene is going to change now dramatically, and we're going to be walking into ground zero, where the houseboat communities actually began. But before I do that, I want to give you a little backstory, a little history. In 1880, the Tidelands Act was passed in California, and it said, Richardson Bay, you're so shallow, is zero tide, only 1 to 2 feet deep. We're just going to divide you into plots, sell you off, fill you in, and increase our tax base. And they passed this law. A couple of the boys on the waterfront hear about it. Their name, Arquez. They end up buying most of the underwater plots along the Sausalito waterfront. They end up owning most of the Sausalito waterfront. What we're going to be walking into is Donlin Arquez's salvage yard. He was a salvage guy. Now remember, in 1937, the bridges were built. The Richmond-San Rafael Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge. All these beautiful old ferry boats like Yellow Ferry and Issaquah Ferry and the Charles Van Dam, they all became obsolete. What happens to an old ferry boat when it becomes obsolete? It goes to the salvage yard for demolition. However, Donlin Arquez is a special guy, and he believes if you're a man or a woman and you have a dream, you ought to be given the work and living space to allow it to happen. So he would bring these old ferry boats up onto the mudflats in Sausalito, open them up, and let people live in them for free. He was the father of the houseboat communities. So as we go forward, you're going to see that things are changing a bit. It's a little rough and tumble. Some of the original boats are still here that were here in the beginning. Some of the original residents that were here at the beginning are still here. They are rough and tumble, but they are proud. If they hadn't fought the houseboat wars and fought off the county and the city and everybody else for the right to have the way of life, none of the houseboats would be here today. So as we approach ground zero, we notice things are changing. The infrastructure is not quite the same. For instance, this little building here, this is a historic building. This is the bait shop from the Napa Street Pier. Okay, she was once floating on a wooden barge, long rotted away. Now when she floats at high tide like today, she's really just floating on those styrofoam pads you see beneath her deck. Here we are standing in front of the historic artifact. Ferry wheel and paddle and smokestack from the Charles Van Dam ferry boat, the 1916 ferry boat that used to run between San Rafael and Richmond. And there's a big story here, so I want you to stay with me for a minute, okay? Here's what happened. On 3 high tides, Donlin Arquez and a large Mexican woman by the name of Juanita Munson pulled the Charles Van Dam up onto the mudflats here in Sausalito, and they opened up Juanita's Galley. It was a restaurant. It's on top of the Charles Van Dam. Here's a picture of Juanita's Galley at the top of the Van Dam when she was up on the mudflats right here. And the joke was, if you came to Juanita's for breakfast, you better bring your own because you're not going to get fed till lunch. She always carried a rooster on her shoulder and an oversized rolling pin. She was mean, but everybody liked her. Okay. Juanita left the galley, and a new nightclub owner moved in. We're talking fancy nightclub with velvet curtains and pillows and the whole thing. Well, coincidentally, in Sausalito, we had a nationally renowned recording studio called The Plant. And in between sessions, the recording artists were coming over here and hanging out at the nightclub. All of a sudden, we're listening to the Mamas and the Papas, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Sly and the Family Stone. Wow! All right? When the people from the city find out, they're over here in their top hats and tails and mink coats and high heels. Until one day, this nightclub owner looks around and says, you know, maybe this isn't such a good place for a fancy nightclub. Because while this is happening, the Bohemians have come in from San Francisco's North Beach. They've taken anything they can find in Donlin's salvage yard, pieces of World War II boats, anything floating, they put it together and called it home. And Donlin was letting them do it. And there were hundreds of people living out here, free and wild, off the grid, floating out there. So the nightclub owner leaves, and the Charles Van Dam ferry boat is offered to the city of Sausalito as a library. The city turns it down. And that's when this ragtag community says, well, that's our clubhouse. And for $2 on a Friday and Saturday night, all the beer you could drink and dance to Joe Tate. And the Redlegs, all right. Well, Joe Tate became the center of the houseboat wars. And when the county finally came in to take it all down, it was Joe's boat they went after. Joe lived on a 65-foot standard oil tug called the Richmond. And the demolition permit had the name Richmond on it, so they went looking for that boat. Well, Joe, being a smart fellow, took his paintbrush and painted out the name Richmond and renamed the boat Whitefin. So these county officials, they couldn't find Joe's boat. And the community led them on a wild goose chase. There were jousting matches with oars. People were being thrown in the water. The county officials went away. They didn't come back. Okay? These people fought for their right to live the way they wanted to, and they won. And this is the reason, only reason any of this is here. These people fought for it. Now, Joe Tate eventually sailed away with his buddies off to Hawaii on the Whitefin, and the county came in and bulldozed the Charles Van Dam. But we are standing on top of the hull of the Charles Van Dam ferry boat. And if you look around us, you'll see what this community has done to honor the place where the Van Dam once was. They've built a beautiful community garden outlining the hull of the Van Dam. And in here, they have all sorts of sculptures and artwork and plants and variety. And it's a really rich and beautiful expression from this original houseboat community.